The chipped formica of the diner booth felt cold even through my jacket. I'd been staring at the same sugar dispenser for 15 minutes, trying to work out how much of the next rent payment I could cover if I called in sick to my second job. Josie, the waitress, kept giving me these sympathetic looks, sliding over refills even when my coffee was still half full. It wasn't sympathy, not really. It was recognizing a stiff when she saw one. I needed this radio gig, badly. And the diner, with its perpetually damp smell of bacon and regret, was the last place I wanted to be thinking about it. The station, WCRL, wasn't much to look at from the outside. A low, flat building, all beige brick and frosted glass, tucked between a muffler shop and a laundromat that always smelled vaguely of bleach. It looked temporary, like it had been assembled from parts and might blow away in a strong wind. The parking lot was mostly cracked asphalt, with a single struggling maple trying to grow out of the concrete near the entrance. I parked at the far end, wanting to be close to an escape route, which felt ridiculous even as I thought it. It's a radio station, Kieran, not a prison. Inside, it smelled like dust and old electronics. Not a clean, sterile dust, but the kind that's been accumulating for decades, mixed with the faint, sweet odor of aging vacuum tubes. The reception area was small, dominated by a window looking into the studio, and a corkboard covered in faded concert flyers and community announcements. A rotating fan in the corner did little to move the air. Connie, the daytime operator, was about to leave. She was all tight smiles and brisk efficiency. Kieran, right? Overnight shift. Keys are in the drawer. Lauren will be around tomorrow to go over the automation system. Don't let the silence get to you. The silence. That was what she focused on. I just nodded, trying to appear competent. She handed me a thick ring of keys, then pointed to a small, unmarked door off the reception area. Supply closet. Everything you need's in there. And oh, almost forgot. She disappeared into the closet for a moment and emerged with a folded piece of paper taped to the inside of the door frame. Old management thing. Just read it. And don't bother trying to find anyone to explain it. They won't. She didn't meet my eyes. The supply closet was cramped, smelling strongly of cardboard and cleaning fluid. I pulled the paper free. It was a single sheet, yellowed with age, covered and typed in handwritten notes. A list, rules, apparently. 1. Every 30 minutes, record the signal strength and ambient temperature in the physical log. Do not estimate. Do not skip entries. I frowned. 30 minutes? Seriously? That was going to be a lot of writing. I pictured myself, bleary-eyed at 3 a.m., meticulously documenting the fluctuations of a radio signal. Probably pointless. Still, a job's a job. 2. Do not fall asleep anywhere on the premises except the designated rest area. If you wake up anywhere else, do not move until you have spoken your name aloud. Okay, now this was just weird. A rest area? I hadn't seen one. And the bit about saying your name? That felt unnecessary. Paranoia, probably. Some previous employee who'd had a bad dream and decided to write it down as policy. 3. Any incident report filed more than 2 years ago is sealed. Do not request, reference, or search for it. Why would I even want to read old incident reports? That felt less paranoid and more controlling. Though it did make me wonder what kind of things happened here before. I quickly dismissed the thought, not my business. 4. Do not make personal copies of any on-site documentation. Not photographs, not handwritten transcriptions, not digital scans. Information belongs to the premises. That was oddly specific, like they'd had trouble with someone photocopying things. Maybe someone was trying to steal their top-secret radio playlists. I snorted. 5. If the lights go out, stay exactly where you are. Do not use a flashlight or your phone light. Wait for them to come back on. Now I was starting to feel slightly irritated. This was getting ridiculous. What kind of antiquated system required complete darkness during a power outage? It was a safety hazard. But I told myself it was probably just a quirk of the old wiring. 6. Do not use the service entrance alone. If no one is available to accompany you, use the main entrance regardless of inconvenience. The service entrance was a heavy steel door around the back. I'd noticed it on the way in. Seemed reasonable enough, I guess. Just good security practice. 7. Do not laugh out loud when alone anywhere on the premises. Smiling is fine. Laughter alone in an empty space is an invitation. I stared at that one for a long moment. An invitation to what? This was bordering on absurd. Some old night watchman with a penchant for ghost stories, no doubt. I almost chuckled, then stopped myself, just in case. 8. If the same visitor comes 2 days in a row asking for the same person or service that is unavailable, notify management. On the third day, do not engage with them. That sounded unsettling, but again, probably just a past issue with a persistent caller or something. I folded the paper and stuffed it into my jacket pocket. It felt heavier than it should. Connie had already left, the door clicking shut behind her. I was alone. The studio was dimly lit, the console glowing with a soft green light. The clock on the wall read 11:57 p.m., 3 minutes until my shift officially began. I pulled the logbook towards me, a thick, spiral-bound volume, and uncapped a pen. The air was still, and the silence, as Connie had warned, was already pressing in around me. I checked the signal strength, noted the temperature, 68 degrees, and wrote it all down. My hand felt strangely cold. I was cataloging the commercial breaks. Old CDs mostly, local car dealerships, mattress stores, a lawyer specializing in personal injury. The usual. It wasn't exactly stimulating work, but it paid the bills, or at least slowed the bleeding. I'd ripped out the paper inserts from the CD cases. Those were just clutter, and was stacking the discs in neat piles, sorted by client. It was a mindless task, and I liked that, needed that actually. After everything with Sarah, after months of hospital smells and worried phone calls, quiet repetition was a balm. The studio was colder than it had been earlier. Not dramatically so, but enough that I noticed. 66 degrees, the thermostat said. I glanced at the window, overcast. November in Ohio, the kind of gray that seeped into your bones. I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I hadn't bothered with coffee yet, just hadn't felt the need. I was running on a strange, low-grade adrenaline, fueled by anxiety and a desperate need to keep everything from falling apart. I checked my watch, 12:17 a.m. time for the first official log entry of the new hour. The rule about logging, it was annoying, frankly. Every 15 minutes, record signal strength, temperature, and atmospheric conditions. Atmospheric conditions, what did that even mean? Visibility, humidity. I'd just been writing clear for now. It felt like a box-ticking exercise designed to justify someone's job. Still, a rule was a rule. I didn't get paid to question things, I got paid to follow instructions. I dutifully wrote down the readings in the logbook. Signal strength, steady at 88. Temperature, 66. Atmospheric conditions, clear. I capped the pen and was about to start sorting through another stack of CDs when I noticed something odd. The logbook wasn't new, it looked well used, and flipping back a few pages, I saw entries from previous shifts, previous weeks. And then I started reading. The entries weren't just numbers and clear skies. They contained descriptions. Vague, disjointed descriptions. Static on line 3, accompanied by a low hum. Temperature dropping in the east corridor, despite heating. Brief visual distortion in the security camera feed, Sector 7. Resembled movement. One entry, dated 3 nights ago, made my stomach clench. Temperature 62, atmospheric conditions, a scent of dust and something else. Metallic. Brief sensation of being watched from the stairwell. A scent? A sensation? Connie hadn't mentioned any of this. She just handed me the list of rules and left. I flipped further back. More of the same. Entries describing flickering lights, unexplained noises, and a recurring reference to a pressure in the control room. One entry from nearly a month ago simply said, "They're listening," underlined twice. It was unsettling, but obviously it was just someone with an overactive imagination. Probably Lorne. I remembered Connie mentioning he was a bit of a conspiracy theorist, or maybe Uwe, the overnight guy before Lorne. People got bored on these shifts. They started seeing things. It was the isolation, the quiet, the darkness. It messed with your head. Then I remembered the logging rule. Every 15 minutes. No estimation, no skipping. I glanced at the clock. 12:21 p.m. 4 minutes passed. I had missed the log entry. A knot tightened in my chest. It wasn't a big deal, right? Just a few minutes. I could write it now, backdate it. No one would know. But the words on the page, the impression of the rule, do not estimate, do not skip entries, echoed in my mind. It felt important. More important than it should. I hesitated. I needed to call Sarah. She hadn't been feeling well this morning, and I'd promised to check in. But the log, the rule, I couldn't shake the feeling that ignoring it, even for a few minutes, would be a mistake. It wasn't logical, it wasn't rational. But the weight of those earlier entries, the strange, specific details, pressed down on me. I sighed, picked up the pen, and wrote the log entry for 12:15 a.m. Signal strength, 88. Temperature, 66. Atmospheric conditions, clear. I made it neat, precise, as if to somehow erase the 4 minutes that had passed. As I capped the pen, a high-pitched whine started coming from the speakers. It wasn't a broadcast, not music, not static, just a pure, unwavering tone that made my teeth ache. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. I glanced at the security monitor. Sector 7. The stairwell. The image was distorted, not a glitch, something bending the picture. I needed to call Sarah. I really did. But the whine continued. The distortion grew, and the logbook lay open in front of me, waiting for the next entry. 15 minutes. I had to wait 15 minutes. I was relabeling the commercial tapes. It was tedious. Hours of fast-forwarding, scribbling dates and times on the plastic sleeves with a Sharpie. The station manager, Lorne, was a stickler for organization. He said it made the advertising reps feel more confident. I doubted the reps even looked at the tapes, but it was a job requirement, so I did it. The smell of the plastic was acrid, almost chemical. It clung to my fingers. I kept wiping them on my jeans, but it didn't really help. The break room was small, tucked between the studio and the transmitter room. It had a chipped Formica table, a microwave that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 1970s, and a single vinyl-covered chair. I dragged the chair closer to the small window overlooking the parking lot, hoping for a bit of fresh air. It smelled like exhaust fumes and damp concrete out there, but it was better than the stale, recycled air in the station. I'd been at it for almost 1 hour, lost in the monotony, the rhythmic clicking of the tape player, the scratch of the Sharpie, the hum of the building's ancient HVAC system. It was soothing, in a way, a blankness that pushed back against the worry about Sarah, about the bills, about everything. I hadn't even realized how tired I was until my head started to nod. Just a little dip, a momentary lapse. Then I must have dozed off. I woke with a jolt, my neck stiff, my cheek pressed against the cool vinyl. The tape player had stopped. Silence, complete, unnerving silence. The parking lot was dark, the only light coming from the security lamps casting long, distorted shadows. I blinked, trying to shake off the grogginess. It felt like I'd been asleep for hours, but the clock on the wall said it had only been a few minutes. And then I remembered something, a fragment of a rule, dredged up from the fog of exhaustion. Don't sleep except the rest area if you wake up. Something about saying your name. It wasn't clear, just a jumbled impression, probably just a safety precaution. Something about being disoriented. It made sense. Falling asleep in a weird place could be confusing. I started to push myself up, my muscles protesting. The room felt wrong, colder than before, and the air was thick, heavy, like trying to breathe underwater. I almost stood, then a flicker of something in my peripheral vision stopped me. Just a shadow, I told myself, a trick of the light. But the rule, that half-remembered instruction, pressed against me. Don't move, say your name. Kieran, I mumbled, the sound swallowed by the silence. It felt foolish, ridiculous, like a child playing a game. But I said it again, louder this time. Kieran Davies. I stood up slowly, carefully, testing my balance. The room didn't shift, didn't change, but the heavy feeling in the air didn't dissipate either. I glanced toward the door, then back at the window. The security lights had flickered, just once, but I'd seen it. I finished relabeling the tapes mechanically, my movements precise and deliberate. I didn't sit down again. I didn't close my eyes. I just kept working. The smell of the plastic filling my nostrils, the hum of the building pressing in on me. When the last tape was labeled, I stacked them neatly in a box, then carried it back to Lorne's office. The lock on the office door felt colder than I remembered. As I turned it, I noticed a small scratch on the metal, a new mark I hadn't seen before. It looked deliberate, like someone had tried to pick the lock. I didn't mention it to Lorne when I dropped off the tapes. He wouldn't have cared, but I made a mental note to check it again on my next shift. I had a feeling things were going to keep getting stranger. The overnight shift was settling into a rhythm, the kind of quiet routine that could be peaceful. It was a fragile peace, built on the hum of the transmitter and the occasional static burst, but peace nonetheless. I was in the archive room, a small windowless space crammed with boxes of old commercials and station IDs. My task was to sort through them, identifying anything that hadn't been digitized yet. Mostly it was local businesses long gone. Honest Abe's Used Cars, Millie's Diner, Bob's Radio and TV Repair. Each tape felt like holding a piece of someone else's forgotten life. The air in the archive was always stale, thick with the scent of dust and decaying magnetic tape. It smelled like my grandfather's basement, a smell that used to be comforting but now just felt old. I was running a gloved finger along the spines of the boxes, trying to decipher the faded labels. Most were neatly organized, but a few were haphazardly stacked, almost thrown in. I pulled one down, a larger box labeled simply Local, 1988 to 1992. Inside, there were more tapes than the box seemed capable of holding. They were crammed in, some bent and warped. I started pulling them out, making a mental list of what needed attention. That's when I found it, tucked beneath a stack of audio dramas. A file folder manila and thick, with a red sticker on the front. Incident Report, Confidential. My first thought was that it was misplaced. Everything else was audio, and this was clearly paperwork. It didn't fit. I almost put it back, figuring Lorne would know where it belonged. But curiosity, a stupid, persistent habit, got the better of me. I opened the folder. Inside were a few typed pages, covered in handwritten notes and what looked like official stamps. The heading was stark: WCRL, Incident Report, date, July 14, 1987. The report detailed some kind of disturbance during the overnight shift. Vague descriptions of fluctuations in the signal, strange noises, a feeling of being watched. It sounded like someone had a bad night, maybe a little sleep-deprived, imagining things. Probably just someone trying to explain a technical glitch, exaggerating for effect. I started to skim the details, looking for a report number, something to help me figure out where it should be filed. The handwriting was frantic, almost illegible in places. Then I saw a phrase that stopped me cold. Temporal distortion localized to Studio B. My gut clenched, a cold, hard knot. I didn't know why, but that phrase, it felt wrong. The whole thing felt wrong. I remembered, suddenly, a fragment of something, a warning buried deep in the list Connie had given me. Something about old incidents, something about not looking, not searching, not even acknowledging they existed. It wasn't a clear recall, more a feeling of prohibition, a weight pressing down on me. It wasn't about safety, exactly, it was about avoidance. The report number was right there at the bottom of the page. I could easily find the corresponding archive, understand what happened that night, but the memory, fragmented as it was enough. It felt like standing on the edge of a precipice. I slammed the folder shut. It sounded too loud in the small room. My fingers were tingling, a prickly sensation spreading up my arms. I didn't even look at the file again. I carefully placed the folder back in the box, burying it under the warped audio dramas, and closed the lid. I didn't report the misplaced file to Lorne. I didn't ask anyone about the incident. I just finished sorting the remaining tapes, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. The smell of dust and decay seemed stronger now, overwhelming. The silence felt expectant. When I left the archive room, I didn't turn the light off. I just walked out and closed the door behind me. I didn't need to know what happened on July 14, 1987. I had a feeling knowing would be far, far worse than not knowing. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that whatever was in that file, whatever happened that night, was something I absolutely did not want to wake up to. It was 3 a.m., the automated voice announcing the time, smooth and practiced, felt like a personal intrusion. I was cataloging the commercial breaks, not the tapes themselves, thankfully just a spreadsheet listing which ads ran during which hours. Tedious, mind-numbing work, but it paid the bills. Or, more accurately, it delayed the bills from becoming actively catastrophic. Josie was handling the bulk of the paperwork with the hospital, but even she needed a breather. The spreadsheet was on my laptop, the screen's pale glow reflecting in the chipped formica of the desk. I was matching times to ad scripts, making sure everything lined up with the station's legal requirements. It was a new system, implemented last month, and Lorne had been insistent on meticulous accuracy. He kept muttering about FCC fines and lawsuits. Honestly, it felt like busy work, something to keep the overnight guy occupied, away from the tapes and the archive room. I'd had 3 cups of coffee since my last break, and the caffeine jitter was starting to wear off, leaving me feeling sluggish and strangely disconnected. The studio was quiet, the only sound the hum of the equipment and the occasional crackle from the speakers. Usually, even at this hour, there was some residual noise from the city, a distant siren, a car alarm, the rumble of a late-night bus. Tonight, it was just still, unnaturally so. I kept glancing at the clock. Another hour and 30 minutes until my next mandatory log entry. I'd already missed one earlier, gotten lost in the archive room, distracted by that file. I hadn't told anyone, just added a fake entry in the log, hoping no one would notice. It felt dishonest, but the thought of explaining myself to Lorne, of admitting I'd been snooping, was worse. The list of rules Connie had given me was still swirling in my head. I couldn't quite grasp it all, the sheer volume of prohibitions and requirements. It felt arbitrary, paranoid, but after everything that happened, I knew it wasn't just a collection of eccentricities. Those rules were real, they had teeth. The sleep thing having to say my name felt ridiculous, but it happened. And the feeling after reading that file, that lingering wrongness, I was trying to recall the specifics of the rules about documentation. There was something about not altering records, about preserving the original format, and something else, something about copies. I couldn't quite pull it up. It felt like trying to grasp smoke. Then I remembered the sheet posted near the coffee machine. It was a laminated summary of the most important rules, the ones you needed to have at your fingertips. I pushed back from the desk and walked towards the break room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. There it was, tacked to the corkboard amongst the outdated promotional flyers and staff memos. Station protocols, essential guidelines. I scanned the list, my eyes searching for the section on documentation. It was near the bottom, under Archive Access. Do not make personal copies of any on-site documentation. Not photographs, not handwritten transcriptions, not digital scans. Information belongs to the premises. That was it. Simple enough. I'd been worried about getting the logging thing wrong again, about another rule snapping into place, but this felt different, less urgent. It wasn't about avoiding a specific consequence, more about respecting a general principle. Information stayed here, it didn't leave. I chuckled to myself, a dry, humorless sound. I was being paranoid. I wasn't planning on taking anything. I just wanted to remember the rules, to have them firmly in my head. I was starting to feel like I needed a cheat sheet for basic existence. But then I thought about the file, about the vague sense of dread it had evoked, about the way the information felt dangerous. If that file was best left forgotten, maybe all the rules were too. Maybe the best way to stay safe was to have them memorized, to be able to navigate this place without relying on the posted notices. I pulled out my phone. It was a stupid idea. I knew even as I was doing it. But the thought of carrying those rules around in my head, of having them readily accessible, felt reassuring. I opened the camera app and framed the sheet, centering on the section about documentation. One picture. Just one. To help me remember. As the flash illuminated the laminate, a static burst erupted from the studio speakers, so loud it made me jump. Not a crackle, not a pop, but a harsh, abrasive screech. It cut off as quickly as it started, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. I lowered my phone, my heart suddenly doing something odd in my chest. Not racing, not pounding, but a slow, heavy thud like a muffled drumbeat. I looked back at the sheet, then at my phone. The screen was frozen. Not crashed, not black, just frozen on the camera app, the image of the rules, distorted and flickering. I tried to swipe, to close the app, to do anything. But the screen didn't respond. It was like looking at a photograph of something that wasn't quite there. Then, a strange warmth spread through the phone, radiating outwards into my hand. Not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. It felt like holding something that was alive. I quickly turned off the phone, pressing the power button until the screen went black. The warmth faded, but the feeling lingered. And now, there was a faint, almost imperceptible vibration in my palm. I didn't take another picture. I didn't try to restart the phone. I slipped it into my pocket and walked back to the desk, a cold knot forming in my stomach. I didn't need to remember the rule now. I had a feeling it would remember me. I resumed the spreadsheet, but my hands were clumsy, my focus shattered. The silence in the studio felt heavier now, pressing down on me. I glanced at the archive room door. It was closed, but I could swear I saw a faint shadow flicker beneath it. I forced myself to look away, to concentrate on the endless rows of numbers and ad scripts, but I knew, with a sickening certainty, that something had changed, and whatever it had come with me. I was cataloging the public service announcements. Not the pre-recorded ones, the ones local businesses paid for. Bob's Discount Tires, Agnes's All-You-Can-Eat Pancake House, Lorne's Taxidermy. A real cross-section of the town. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was mindless. Each PSA had a specific code, a date, a runtime. I'd input it into the spreadsheet, verify the file existed in the archive, and mark it as verified. It was a system, and I needed a system. It kept the everything else at bay. The studio was quiet, as always. The hum of the console, the faint whir of the ventilation, the occasional static hiss from the speakers. I'd brewed a fresh pot of coffee earlier, and the smell was still lingering, a slightly burnt, vaguely comforting aroma. I was on the last reel, mostly Pancake House ads, when I noticed the flickering. It wasn't the lights themselves, not at first. It was the digital clock on the console, the little red numbers stuttering, blinking out of sync. I glanced up at the fluorescent tubes overhead. Steady. Then the lights went out, just off. No flicker, no warning, just sudden, absolute darkness. My first reaction was irritation. Great. Just great. A power outage on my shift. I reached instinctively for my phone, my thumb already finding the power button. A flashlight. That's all I needed. A quick check of the breaker box, maybe a reset, and I could get back to work. But then, something snagged in my memory. A phrase fragmented and indistinct, something I'd read on that sheet. Something about the lights, a warning. If the lights go out, stay where you are, it wasn't a full recall, more a sense of dread attached to the idea. It felt ridiculous, of course, a complete waste of time. Probably a safety precaution for the engineers or something still. The feeling was insistent. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the phone's power button. I told myself it was just a momentary dip, a brownout. The town's power grid wasn't exactly known for its reliability. It would be back on in a minute. No need to be dramatic, no need to fumble around in the dark like an idiot. I forced myself to keep my hands still, to resist the urge to illuminate the room. It was just a momentary power cut. The darkness was absolute. I could feel the cool air on my skin, the smooth plastic of the chair beneath me. The smell of burnt coffee was noticeably stronger now, almost cloying. I closed my eyes, trying to calm my breathing, a slow, deep breath, in, out. That's when I heard it. Not a sound. Exactly, more like a distortion of silence. A subtle shift in the air pressure, a faint, rhythmic pulsing. It wasn't coming from the speakers or the ventilation. It was closer, too close. I kept my eyes closed, refusing to move. The pulsing grew more pronounced, accompanied by a scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. It was slow, deliberate. It wasn't random. It was coming from somewhere, and the darkness felt occupied. I focused on my breathing. In, out. I pictured Josie, her face pale but recovering, sitting up in bed, reading. I thought about the medical bills, the eviction notice, the endless cycle of worry. Anything to distract myself from the growing sense of unease. The scraping stopped directly in front of me. I could feel the air shift again, a subtle breeze against my face. It wasn't a natural breeze. It felt intentional. Then, a shape began to materialize in the darkness. Not a clear shape, not a defined form, more like a negative space, a distortion of the surrounding blackness. I couldn't make out details, but it was tall, impossibly tall, and it was moving. Slowly, deliberately, it shifted and swayed, as if testing the boundaries of the darkness. I didn't dare open my eyes. I didn't dare breathe. I just sat there, frozen, waiting for the lights to come back on. The shape continued to move, drawing closer, closer. It felt like it was outlining me, mapping me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lights flickered back to life. Not a bright, sudden burst, but a gradual return, like waking from a deep sleep. I blinked, my eyes adjusting to the sudden illumination. The studio was exactly as I'd left it. The console, the spreadsheet, the half-empty coffee mug, everything in its place. Except for one thing. On the floor, directly in front of my chair, was a single playing card. The Queen of Spades. It hadn't been there before. It was face up, stark and black against the gray carpet. I hadn't heard it fall. I hadn't seen it appear. It was just there. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I felt the weight of it, the significance of it, pressing down on me. I was still shaking, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. I looked at my phone in my pocket. I didn't turn it on. I didn't need to. I had a feeling I already knew what I'd find. I logged the incident in the spreadsheet. Power outage, lights restored, no damage, standard procedure, but my hand was shaking so badly I could barely type. I glanced at the archive room door, then back at the Queen of Spades. I knew with a chilling certainty that whatever had happened in the dark hadn't been a random event. It hadn't been a malfunction, and it hadn't been a coincidence. I carefully covered the card with a manila folder. I wasn't going to look at it again, but I knew, without a doubt, that it was watching me. I spent the next hour meticulously cleaning the microphone booms. It wasn't a scheduled task, not really. Just something to do with my hands. Something to focus on besides the lingering static in my head and the way the studio seemed to hold its breath. Each boom was the same, a dull gray metal shaft with a fluffy windscreen, smelling faintly of dust and old foam. I unscrewed the windscreens, wiped them down with a damp cloth, then carefully reattached them. It was mindless work, but useful. Good sound quality meant fewer complaints from Lorne, and fewer complaints meant he'd leave me alone. The overnight shifts were always slow, but tonight felt different. Not busier, not more chaotic, just heavier. I kept glancing at the archive room door, but it remained closed and silent. The Queen of Spades stayed hidden under the manila folder, a dark weight in the periphery of my vision. I hadn't touched my phone since finding the card. I didn't want to. Even just looking at it felt risky. Around 2:45 a.m., Josie called. She'd been up all night with little Benji, a fever spiking and refusing to keep anything down. She sounded panicked, her voice tight with exhaustion. She needed me to pick up some children's Tylenol from the 24-hour pharmacy on Elm Street. It was out of the way, but the closest option. She'd already called Uwe, but he was on call for his other job, something with plumbing emergencies. She was desperate. I hesitated. The pharmacy was on the other side of the building, and to get there quickly, I could cut through the alley and use the service entrance. It would save at least 2 minutes, maybe 3. The main entrance meant walking around the entire block, adding precious time to the trip. Josie's voice cracked on the phone. Benji was shivering. That's when it flickered in my memory. Something about entering not through the proper way. It wasn't a specific sentence, more of a pressure behind my eyes. A feeling of wrongness associated with certain doors. I remembered reading something about not being alone when using a particular entrance. It was buried in the document, lost amongst the other bizarre stipulations. A rule about safety, maybe? Or maybe it was about observation. I told myself it was ridiculous. Just paranoia, fueled by lack of sleep and a creepy playing card. Josie needed me, and every second mattered. It was a shortcut, a practical decision. The station was secure, the neighborhood wasn't that bad, and I was a grown man. I could handle a quick trip through an alley. I started to explain to Josie that I was on my way, that I'd be as fast as possible. But my feet were already moving towards the main entrance. It wasn't a conscious decision, not really. It was like a reflex, a sudden, overwhelming compulsion. I found myself walking around the building, the cold night air stinging my face. The back alley felt exposed, vulnerable. Even with the streetlights, the shadows seemed deeper, more watchful. It was stupid, I told myself, completely irrational. I was letting whatever had happened during the power outage get to me. The walk took longer, as expected. 5 minutes, maybe 6. Each step felt heavy, deliberate. I kept checking my watch, imagining Benji's small face, flushed with fever. My own face felt clammy under the cool air. When I finally arrived at the pharmacy, Josie's mother, Trudy, was already there, pacing in the parking lot. She rushed towards me, relief flooding her face. "Thank God you got here. Josie is a wreck. He's barely responsive." I handed over the Tylenol, avoiding Trudy's grateful gaze. I just wanted to get back to the studio, back to the relative safety of the console and the empty airwaves. Trudy stopped me as I turned to leave. "Josie said you were going to cut through the alley?" She was worried, said it's where Old Man Hemlock disappeared from last year. They never found him, you know. I hadn't heard about that. I mumbled something about taking the long way and hurried back to the station. The weight of the delay settling in my chest. It wasn't about the time. Not really. It was about the feeling that I'd made the right decision, but at a cost. Because when I got back to the studio, I saw a message on the console's display. Low battery, emergency generator offline. The backup power system, the one that was supposed to kick in during outages, was failing, and Lorne wasn't answering his phone. The generator was still sputtering. Not a full outage, not yet, but a rhythmic cough that sent a shiver through the building's wiring. It vibrated through the console, a faint tremor in my fingertips. I was running diagnostics mostly to look busy. Lorne would be furious if he knew I hadn't gotten to the maintenance log yet. Another 15 minutes gone, another entry I'd have to fudge. I hadn't even bothered trying to backdate it this time. What was the point? He wasn't coming in. Not tonight. I reached for the lukewarm coffee in my mug, the ceramic chipped from when I dropped it last week. Josie had said it was fine, that it was just a mug. But everything felt breakable lately, like a single wrong move would send the whole thing tumbling down. The coffee tasted stale, but it was warm. That was enough. I scrolled through the news on my phone while I waited for the system checks to complete. Mostly local stuff, a fender bender on Highway 95, the school board meeting, a story about a missing cat. Then I saw it. A meme? A stupid, ridiculous picture of a cat wearing a tiny cowboy hat with the caption, "This is my emotional support animal." It was absurd and I laughed. A genuine, unrestrained laugh. It bubbled up from somewhere deep inside, a sound I hadn't realized I'd been holding back. The studio was silent, of course. It always was. Just the hum of the equipment and the erratic chugging of the generator. The lights at the end of the hall flickered, just once. It was probably nothing. A surge. The generator acting up. This old building was full of electrical gremlins. I'd been here long enough to know. But the laugh had felt wrong. Too loud, too free. It echoed in the empty studio, and the silence that followed felt thick, almost viscous. I quickly muted my phone, my fingers clumsy on the screen. I remembered something, a vague impression from the stack of papers I'd foolishly photographed. Something about sound, not shouting, not yelling, something quieter. Something about not inviting attention. It wasn't a clear recollection, more like a half-formed warning, a prickle on the back of my neck. The rulebook had been long and strange, full of prohibitions I'd dismissed as the eccentricities of some long-dead station manager. But the power outage, the card, the alley, they'd proven me wrong. I tried to tell myself it was a coincidence, that the lights flickering and my laugh were unrelated, that I was just tired, stressed about Josie, and letting my imagination run wild. It was a logical explanation, a reasonable one, but my hand was already reaching for the volume control on the console, turning it down just in case. A purely practical measure. I told myself, reducing the ambient noise, minimizing distractions. I forced myself to focus on the generator diagnostics. The readings were worsening. The fuel level was dropping faster than it should. I needed to call someone, but Lorne still wasn't answering. I briefly considered calling Uwe, the chief engineer, but remembered what Lorne had said. Uwe's a night owl, but don't bother him unless it's a 5-alarm fire. This didn't feel like a 5-alarm fire. It felt like something else, something I couldn't quite define. I glanced back down the hall, towards the darkened rooms. The flickering had stopped. But the air felt colder, heavier. I could swear I smelled something not burning, not electrical, but something metallic and faintly sweet, like pennies and overripe fruit. I shook my head. Exhaustion. That had to be it. I needed to get the log updated, figure out what was happening with the generator, and then just get through the night. Stay busy, stay focused, don't think about the alley, don't think about the card, don't think about the laugh. I started typing the log entry, deliberately omitting the time. A small act of defiance, maybe, or maybe just a desperate attempt to regain some control. As I typed, I noticed a new notification on my phone. A picture message. It was a photo of the Queen of Spades, lying face up on the cracked linoleum floor of the break room. The angle was different. It was closer to the door. I didn't move. I was meticulously cleaning the microphone foam covers. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it was something to do. Each one had to be individually peeled off the mic, inspected for dust and, well, whatever else accumulated overnight, then gently hand-washed with a mild soap solution and allowed to air dry. It was tedious, but it was better than staring at the generator diagnostics, better than thinking about the card, better than wondering if Lorne was actually sick or just avoiding me. The station smelled like old vinyl and stale coffee, a scent I'd grown accustomed to. It wasn't unpleasant. Exactly, just worn, like the building itself. The foam was surprisingly resilient, pliable and springy under my fingers. I'd found that if you stretched them just right, you could hear a faint squeak. I was on my third cover, lost in the rhythm of peel, wash, stretch, when I heard the buzzer. It was the front desk, I sighed. Usually it was just delivery drivers lost and confused, or someone looking for the restrooms. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:47 a.m. Who was looking for a radio station at 2:47 a.m.? I pressed the talk button. Station 2, this is Kieran. Someone to see Mr. Harding, a voice. Connie's, I thought, crackled through the speaker. Says it's important. Lorne wasn't answering his phone, and I wasn't about to wake Uwe. I pressed the button again. Is he expecting someone, Connie? No, sir. He didn't mention anything. It's the same man as yesterday, though, and the day before. He says he needs to speak to Mr. Harding about a plumbing issue. A plumbing issue. That struck me as odd. This was a radio station, not a residential building. We had a contracted maintenance crew for things like that, and the same guy, 3 nights in a row, that felt off, a little tickle of unease ran down my spine. Maybe it was just a persistent salesman, someone really committed to their pitch. People did strange things for a living. I'd been cleaning microphone foam for a living, after all. Then something clicked. A fragmented memory, a blurry image of the rulebook, something about repeat visitors. Not troublemakers, not threats, just repeat visits under false pretenses. A warning buried amongst the other oddities. Something about notifying management or avoiding engagement. I couldn't quite grasp the wording. It was all swirling fragments and half-remembered anxieties. I didn't bother trying to piece it together. I didn't want to check the photograph on my phone. It was enough that something felt wrong. Connie, I said, my voice carefully neutral, just tell him Mr. Harding is unavailable. And if he comes back tomorrow, please let Lorne handle it. He's the one who deals with the building maintenance. But, sir? Just do that, Connie, please. There was a pause. Okay, sir, will do. I released the talk button and leaned back in my chair, suddenly exhausted. It was probably nothing, a harmless eccentric with a fixation on plumbing, but the feeling lingered, a cold spot in the pit of my stomach. I hadn't even looked at the visitor. I hadn't spoken to him. I hadn't engaged. Just redirected. And that felt right. I went back to the microphone foam, but the rhythm was broken. The squeak sounded hollow, brittle. I found myself staring at the small, gray clock on the console. It was 2:51 a.m. I hadn't touched the log in almost 20 minutes. I should update it, but I couldn't bring myself to. The logging requirement felt less like a procedural necessity and more like a trap. Another line to cross, another rule to potentially break. Instead, I walked to the small window overlooking the alley. It was dark and empty. No sign of the visitor. No sign of anything at all. Just the damp brick wall and the overflowing dumpster. I stood there for a long time, watching the darkness, listening to the hum of the aging equipment. The silence was absolute, complete, and I knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in my chest that whatever that rule was meant to prevent, I had just managed to avoid it. But I hadn't seen what I'd avoided, and that, somehow, was the worst part. I felt a strange lightness in my fingers, like they had just released something they didn't even know they were holding. But the silence was still there, and it was different now. It felt expectant. The digital clock on the console blinked 6 a.m. Shift change. I hadn't expected to make it. Honestly, I'd been bracing for something. A final escalation, another visitor, a power surge, anything. But it just ended, like a TV turning off. I shut down the board. The red kill switches felt oddly substantial under my fingers. I didn't bother with a final log entry. What was the point? The habit was already slipping. It felt wrong to record things now, like acknowledging a debt I didn't understand. I just wanted out. The front lobby was empty. Thankfully, Trudy usually arrived a few minutes early, fussing with the coffee machine. I avoided eye contact, just handed over the key and a mumbled, "Quiet night." She barely glanced at me, already absorbed in checking the automated systems. Good. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to explain the exhaustion that felt bone deep or the way my pulse still stuttered if I sat in complete darkness. The walk to the car was cold. October was pushing into November, and the air smelled like wet leaves and exhaust. I found myself scanning the alleyways, not looking for anything, just checking. A useless reflex. A new one. I hadn't noticed when it started, just realized I was doing it. Habit. Like checking the rearview mirror even when there's nothing behind me. My apartment building hadn't changed. Still peeling paint, still the same chipped ceramic dog guarding the entrance. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of lavender and disinfectant hit me. Josie had been cleaning. She was a good woman, Josie. Always cheerful, always willing to lend an ear. I avoided her ear too. "Kieran?" My wife Una called from the bedroom. Her voice was still weak, but stronger than it had been a month ago. "You're back early." Shift ended, I said, keeping my voice flat. Everything was normal. It wasn't a lie, exactly. It was more of an omission, a carefully constructed half-truth. I didn't tell her about the visitor, or the card, or the growing certainty that I'd stumbled into something I couldn't comprehend. She had enough to worry about. The medical bills were still piling up, the eviction notice still looming. I made coffee, carefully measuring the grounds. I used to just eyeball it, but now I had to be precise, exact. Every step, every measurement had to be correct. It was soothing, controlling, even if it was just the coffee. I found myself needing to control things, to impose order on the chaos. It wasn't about the coffee, it was about the ritual. I sat at the kitchen table, sipping the coffee. Una came in, leaning heavily on her cane. She smiled, a tired, fragile smile. "It smells good. Thank you for making it." Of course. I watched her, the muscles in my jaw tight. I wanted to tell her everything, to confess the fear that was still clinging to me, a second skin, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. They felt dangerous, like speaking them would somehow bring it all back. I finished my coffee and went to the living room. I turned on the turntable, put on an old Miles Davis record. The music filled the room, a cool, melancholic balm. I sat in the armchair, closed my eyes and tried to relax. But I couldn't quite let go. I kept seeing the darkness, the empty alley, the faint impression of a playing card. I kept checking the windows, the locks, the shadows. This morning, driving home, I'd passed the radio station again. It was still there, squat and unremarkable. And taped to the window, in the same spot where the shift schedule usually went, was a small, handwritten sign. Now hiring. Overnight board operator.